Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. So today we're going to get our lecture started on interviews. Interviews are an exciting way to expand what we've learned about surveys because there's a lot of similarities in them. The big difference, though, is that with interviews, we're thinking about very qualitative data as opposed to the survey being very quantitative. Now, I want to give you a really clear example of that. Now, a quantitative survey can capture data on the Appalachian Trail's use and completion rate. In fact, I can quote a statistic that has been found numerous years that approximately 1 in 4 persons starting the Appalachian Trail actually finish it. Now, just so you know, in case you aren't aware, the Appalachian Trail is approximately a 2,200-mile trail that starts in Georgia and ends in Maine. But here's the thing about quantitative research. It can be great. We can get statistical data fast about how often things occur and all sorts of other stuff, and even some data about emotion through Likert matrices. But the qualitative data always, and I mean always gets far more meaning and emotion behind the ideas that it captures. Let me share a small excerpt from an interview with someone who hiked the entire Appalachian Trail. And this is their quote from their little interview. "I remember the moment I saw the final sign on Mount Katahdin." That's the last mountain, by the way, at the end of the Appalachian Trail in Maine. "I remember the moment I saw the final sign on Mount Katahdin. I stopped for a moment to think about what I'd done over the last 4 months. Walking 2,000 miles, hurting myself, putting myself through hell. All of a sudden, I realized I was someone new. I didn't know the person from back when I started, and I didn't want to know them ever again." In fact, that's the big difference between these two, is a qualitative and a quantitative study just give very different experiences. They give us very valuable data in both cases, but we can do a lot more with them depending on why we're using the data. Now, I'll tell you, interviews are really great at some things. They catch details and establish themes that a quantitative survey could never even remotely approach. And that last slide was a great example of that. My current book is another example of that. I've done all sorts of quantitative research on climbers in the Red River Gorge, but now I've also written a very interview, qualitative, rich book about their history that is unlike anything else that's ever been done or will probably ever be done, because it has so much detail, themes, and more. In fact, there's very little meaning behind the quantitative data that I've collected other than it just gives us a cross-section of what was happening at that moment. Qualitative data through interviews tells us stories about social experiences. They give us something that we can relate to, something that's emotional, that's tangible, more than just a statistic. They talk about a complex human feeling that can be very hard to measure, or even in some cases basically impossible to measure, especially when we're thinking about the past, because even though a longitudinal survey can try and look at different points, or a retroactive survey can try and look at how people felt in the past, we very rarely can truly quantify how people felt back then. That said, interviews, qualitative in nature, are very weak in some other areas. It took me basically 4 years to write a qualitative book using interviews. Quantitatively, I can crank out a couple of quantitative papers a year. More if I work hard and don't teach as much. I could probably crank out 7 or 8 a year. You'd be lucky to get one qualitative paper a year, even as a PhD, maybe two. The last qualitative paper I worked on took like a year and a half just to write, and it didn't involve interviews. So qualitative papers like this can take a very long time. Likewise, they're complex. A quantitative paper can summarize things in a few statistics sometimes that a qualitative paper would need pages or chapters or even a whole book to do. And interviews, you're going to come to find out, are not quick. In fact, if you want quick data, it's always the survey. The survey is the fastest option that we have, perhaps followed by, maybe observations, and that's a maybe. Everything other than surveys just takes a long time. And in fact, you're going to see with interviews, they especially can take a long time. Now, with interviews, they're very similar to surveys in that we actually use something called a guide. And the guide is like a survey, it has questions. The difference here is that with a survey, we give everyone more or less the same survey. With a guide, we have ideas. Sometimes they're very formal questions. Sometimes they're just a topic that you want to talk about. And the reason that we do that is a really great interview is almost indiscernible from a really great conversation, because they're really the same thing. When we have a great conversation, we're asking people to share their ideas, to tell us how they think and feel and react to things. That's kind of what we're doing with interviews. We're getting that kind of data. And our guide gives us some questions that help us move through that. Like I said, it may be a topic, it may be questions, and you may even choose to not ask everyone every question. In fact, you may sort of do your own skip logic steps here in deciding that sometimes a question isn't relevant to a person. You have answer options in the sense that they can say anything, but you also have options in that you can adapt your questions. By listening and by learning from the person in their earlier answers, you can also ask nuanced questions that you maybe didn't even think of when you were brainstorming what you want to talk about. Because this is a conversation too, you may just decide to take things in very different directions. You may decide to throw the guide out even at some point. And to some degree, that's okay. As long as you're able to answer the research questions that you're going after and get the data that you need, you'll be fine. In fact, that's a very strong similarity in all the methods that we talk about, is we're always going back to answering a sociological research question and testing hypotheses based on our cases. Now, a big difference between surveys and interviews, you can get 5,000 surveys. You will never get 5,000 interviews because you don't have the rest of your life to spend transcribing and analyzing those. In fact, for my book, I think I did around 70 or 80 interviews, and really the heart of the book is around 30 interviews with quotes from those other interviews. It's just interviews take so much longer, whereas, you can analyze 5,000 survey data in a day. So anyways, keep that in mind, that these take a long time. Now, with this guide, where do we start on a guide? It really begins with our research questions, because we know what we want to find out about. We want to find out about a particular topic, whether that's establishing, why a certain group behaves a certain way, or how a group interacts with something. Let's use a climbing example, as I often like to do. We could do interviews to try and understand what it's like to be a female climber in a sport that has long been wrongfully labeled as a male sport. So we could try and do interviews to learn more about that information. And we can set up hypotheses too, in the same way that we would with other stuff. And those hypotheses can help influence what kinds of variables that we need to collect. And we know those variables can translate into our questions. So it's very similar to a survey. We know that we can brainstorm through this process to try and think about the things that we need to ask. So in my question here of what's it like to be a female climber in a sport that's been wrongly labeled as being male, maybe I could ask about specific things. Maybe because I know a little bit about climbing, I could point out that females are often treated as having less skill. And so I could set up a hypothesis saying that females will report being treated as if they have less skill, when this may not be true. So that could be a simple hypothesis that I could set forward, and I'll have the cases to prove or disprove that hypothesis, hopefully. Or go through the process of rejecting the null, as we'll talk about more in later lectures. But we think about what we need to answer our research questions and our hypotheses. And with interviews, we really want to avoid simple questions, because we're doing an interview instead of a survey for a reason. We want to focus on establishing who, what, when, where, why, how, these kinds of questions. But we also want to avoid yes-no answers. And we're also avoiding answering things where they can give simple answers. Because if it's just going to be, oh, I was this, oh, I was that, oh, I was this, yes, no, yes, yes, no. Oh, that was a survey. You didn't need to do a 2-hour interview for that. You needed the interview to get the far more in-depth answers. And even in the case that we find maybe an interviewer is giving us very short answers or yes, no, you can always do that. Well, tell me more about that kind of approach, because we can give them a chance to tell us more about their really simple answers. Again, with the interview, we are going in detail. The survey is a simple, quick, and easy statistic, where the interview is a long, engaged conversation. I'm going to call this lecture there, but in our next couple of lectures, we're going to talk more about preparing for an interview. We'll especially in the next lecture talk about preparing for an interview, conducting the interview, and then what we do after the interview. And in an upcoming lecture too, we'll also talk about the coding process, where we try and make sense of these variables that we want to use in our hypotheses. If you have questions about interviews, you let me know. Likewise, if you decide you like interviews, you'll get a chance to practice those as part of our assignments. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next lecture. Take care.